Welcome everybody to day 4 of the Institute for Palestine Studies conference titled 75 Years of an Ongoing Nakba, the question of knowledge funding, knowledge production. This last session is held in partnership with the Center for Palestine Studies at Columbia University. We're live streaming on Facebook as well. I want to introduce the moderator of the session, Nadim Karkabi. Nadim is a senior lecturer in anthropology at Haifa University and the founding member of Insaniyat, Society of Palestinian Anthropologists. His research on Palestinian alternative music scene examined the politics of pleasure, urban, middle class, and perceptions of self-liberation. Currently, he's working with third-generation Mizrahi Jews on music performances in Arabic language. Nadim, the floor is yours.
شكرا Rana. Good afternoon from Haifa to everyone. I'm honored on behalf of colleagues from the Center of Palestine Studies at the Columbia University to chair this last panel of the multi-sited conference we are having. This panel titled Revisiting the Nakba, Historical Insights, Justice and Memory is very timely as it deals with the Palestinian most forming collective event, and hopefully it would also offer us insights about the ongoing genocidal war in Gaza. So we have a large cadre with us tonight, and there are 5 speakers who will each speak around 15 to 20 minutes. And then hopefully we'll have time for discussion as the event is for 2 hours until 7. So without further ado, I will present the first speaker today. Hadil Asali is a postdoctoral scholar at the Center for Science and Society at the Columbia University, where she's also a lecturer in the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences. She holds a PhD in anthropology and has a previous career as a chemical engineer. Her work focuses on southern Palestine, especially Gaza, and the ongoing colonial legacies of geology and related earth sciences that come up against local, intimate forms of knowledge of the land. Hadil, تفضلي.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to dive right in so that I can make my time. Okay. In 1969, 2 years after the Israeli occupation took control of the Gaza Strip, several Zionist schemes were concocted in an attempt to dilute the Palestinian population, especially that of the camps. Among the many more well-known population transfers were, for example, the mass transfer from Gaza to Jordan. But here I'll focus on a very secretive one, such as the scheme aimed to send 60,000 Palestinians to Paraguay. Paraguay, not Uruguay. Most people confuse the two. Paraguay is a landlocked and isolated country that was under a long-standing brutal military dictatorship at the time. I learned about this story, this transfer scheme, through my great-uncle Mahmoud, who was at the time, in 1969, a 19-year-old refugee in Maghazi camp. He had just completed his training as a carpenter in the UNRWA vocational schools when he heard about a worker program in Brazil. At the time, there were many Palestinians going to work abroad. His own brother had left earlier for a work program in Germany, and many were going to the Gulf states for work. All these young people were going abroad to work. Of course, this worked in Israel's favor, who was actively de-developing the economy of Gaza and ultimately wished to dispose of the Palestinian population. Mahmoud and several others went to the Petra travel agency in order to sign up for the worker program, but they were taken to Paraguay instead. They met other Palestinians who had arrived before them and told them that there was no worker program. They had all been tricked and fallen victim to this transfer scheme and had no way to return. Initially, when my uncle told me the story, I had no way to substantiate it, as I did not at the time have access to archives, or, as a former engineer, I had no idea how to even begin doing social research for such a story. It's not that I did not believe him, but who else could believe such a thing? His 4 kids did not know much of the details, nor did his multitude of siblings. How could our family even begin to think about justice for his dispossession when the details were so murky? It was not until I left my career as an engineer and arrived at Columbia University when things started to reveal themselves. A former Israeli anti-Zionist refusnik was in my first seminar and had by chance found the documents to prove his story in the Israeli State Archives. This was in 2013, and by now the archives are much less accessible because, according to him, too many people were finding things. Fortunately for me, this particular Israeli was generous in handing over the papers and translating them, rather than keeping them for himself to publish as others have with zero Palestinian perspective. Another scholar, Jean Tawfiq Karam, had recently written about this Paraguay story briefly, and his article at the time was not easy to find. It was only available on microfilm at the Columbia Library. I think by now it is all digitized and easier to locate, but at the time it took quite a bit of digging. I got in touch with Karam and he shared with me that no one would believe his story. My phone call to him validated him, and he had a longer article on the subject coming out for publication. He very generously shared with me all the archives he found in Paraguay and the contact of another living survivor of the transfer scheme who was still living in Asuncion, which is the capital city. In the Paraguayan archives, which are also known as the Archivo de Terror, were the names of 21 other transferees and written testimonies from 11 of them. They were all Gazans who arrived to Asuncion in 1969, and 11 testified that they had left through a travel agency called Petra, and their departure was arranged by the owner of the agency, a man named Gad Graver. I flew to Paraguay to interview the other transferee, Talal, that Karam had found, and I set aside temporarily the follow-up with the Petra travel agency and the owner, Gad Graver. The Israeli refusnik from my earlier seminar helped me get in touch with Israeli journalist Yossi Melman, who along with Dan Raviv had broken the story in the 1980s after a long gag order by the Israeli government. I went to interview him the following year. Melman explained to me that the architect of the scheme was an Italian Zionist named Ada Sereni. Formerly Ada Ascarelli, she came from an aristocratic Jewish family in Italy and married into the Sereni family, another aristocratic Jewish family. She and her husband Enzo Sereni were zealous Zionists who had traveled to places like Iraq to encourage Jews there to emigrate to the new Israeli state as it was forming. Ada Sereni in particular became known for bringing Jews illegally to Palestine by sea while it was still under British mandate. It was for this reason that 2 decades later, then Prime Minister Levi Eshkol tapped her to deal with another population transfer, how to get the Palestinians out of Gaza. Quote, "I want them all to go, even if they go to the moon," he had told her. But much to Melman's chagrin, the journalist, Sereni was an amateur who did not plan the transfer scheme well. In the end, it came to an end when 2 Palestinians, one of which was Dalal, attempted to confront the Israeli ambassador in Paraguay at the time. A shooting occurred and the 2 ended up in prison, but the transfer scheme came to an end. We may never know how many were actually transferred. Later, back at Columbia, an Italian anthropologist told me much more about Ada Sereni, that she and her husband had founded Givat Brenner, one of the largest kibbutzes that also served as a base for the Haganah and the Palmach, and is still frequented by many European Jews to this day. I tried going further down that research road to find more on Ada Sereni, but I had hit a dead end and decided to turn my attention to the Israeli travel agency, Petra, the one that flew the Palestinians out to Paraguay. The Petra travel agency was founded in Palestine before the state of Israel was created and continues to operate in Tel Aviv to this day. I asked another Israeli anti-Zionist colleague to go into the agency, which was a newly renovated brick and mortar building in a fancy part of Tel Aviv, and I asked him to inquire on my behalf if they have any information about this time period. An elderly woman working there immediately started bragging to him about their history of weapon and human trafficking and told him that the owner, Gad Graver, was still alive. So my colleague called him, I listened in, and at first Graver also started bragging about their history of trafficking. However, when my colleague mentioned Paraguay, Graver stopped talking. He asked if there was actually anything in the documents we found that mentioned Paraguay, and ultimately that he could not help us. It was not until this moment that I realized that none of the Israeli sources mentioned in their writers Petra, Graver, or even Ada Sereni. Tom Segev is another Israeli source who had written about Israel's attempt to transfer populations in his book on 1967. He had written a glowing description of Addasurani in a chapter titled The Blunder, in which he describes Israeli leaders' debates about what to do with this newly occupied Palestinian population. However, he never mentions Paraguay at all. Similarly, Yossi Melman and Dan Raviv, in their article breaking the story, left it at travel agency without mentioning Petra. Surely, as Israeli scholars and journalists with unfettered access to archives, they knew these details. But it was after my cut-off conversation with Graver that I realized that any mention of Petra or Graver came solely from Palestinian testimonies. Many anti-colonial scholars have offered valuable lessons as well as methodological approaches for contending with archives produced and held in colonial conditions. Anthropologist Michel Trujillo, in his work on Haiti, argues that the making of archives and historical narratives are a series of selection of evidence, of themes, of procedures, and by nature are also a series of exclusions. It is in these selections that power surreptitiously enters the story and in turn reifies dominant colonial historical narratives. Trujillo sees value in recovering the silence narratives and setting the story straight. For to follow the silence and the selections is to deepen our understanding of how power operates. Anthropologist Anne Stoller also approaches colonial archives through an ethnographic lens in her work. She advises us to neither uncritically take colonial archives as authoritative sources, nor to simply set out to disprove them, but instead to focus our ethnographic attention on archiving as process rather than archives as things. Understanding the processes by which archives functions offers another method for tracing the machinations of power. Edward Said calls for a contrapuntal reading of colonial works, rereading them through the eyes of the colonized. Although he was referring to works of literature, most famously Camus' The Stranger, contrapuntal reading through the eyes of the colonized reveals quite a bit in this case, namely that all Israeli sources have participated in obscuring details about the perpetrators while almost entirely excluding perspectives of the Palestinian victims of the transfer. These Israeli sources, like Said's examples, are ideologically committed to the colonial project and diametrically opposed to the Palestinian right of return or any notion of liberation. These sources also consider the Paraguay transfer scheme a failure, not because it harmed Palestinians, but because it did not successfully meet its objectives of transferring more out. Learning to forget is how Joel Bedin describes Zionist renditions of history, thus enabling them to deflect blame and avoid acknowledgement of ethnic cleansing. Forgetting occurs through a few mechanisms: limiting self-critical accounts to Hebrew, excluding Palestinian narratives, and making political rather than historical claims about the Palestinian refugee problem, such as it was their own fault. The prototypical example he gives is Benny Morris, but in this case of my story, the Benny Morris of the story was Yossi Melman, the journalist who during our interview claimed to be a liberal against West Bank settlements, but refused to support the right of return for Palestinians, despite being a settler from Poland himself, and later blamed all the Palestinian problems on incompetent Arab leaders. Writing on socialist, leftist, Zionist colonies, on kibbutzes, Arish Sabahuri takes this study of learning to forget a step further and theorizes a form of settler colonial memory based not merely on erasure, but on recognition and disavowal. Her study helps us make sense of the hand-wringing concerns of leftist and liberal Zionists who are nonetheless committed to the Zionist project of expelling Palestinians, or what Benny describes as shooting and crying. She shows how memory and forgetting have been mobilized by the leftist kibbutz communities to legitimize their settler colonial practices, and finds that far from simply erasing Palestinian histories, the Zionists in fact depended on them for their internal debates for their own modes of knowledge and self-representation. Quote, a key characteristic of settler colonial memory, I find, is that it tethers the settlers to the indigenous in a simultaneous process of recognition and disavowal, end quote. It is not a psychological process, but a social and political one where the settler needs the native. Thus, she argues for a more dynamic approach to understanding settler colonial memory beyond the binary of remembering and forgetting, one that would take into account the process of recognition and disavowal. This, she demonstrates, helps us better understand the many machinations and contradictions in liberal Zionist narratives, and we can see this mechanism at work in both Melman and Tom Segev's work. Melman had ended his 1988 article, in which he broke the story of the transfer scheme, by suggesting that Israel may have no choice but to expel more Palestinian. Quote, Kahan's message, expel the Palestinians or risk losing Jewish control of the land, remains a potent one. And in the absence of a political solution to the Palestinian problem, Israel may be pushed towards such desperate measures, end quote. The original article in Hebrew has another paragraph that is absent in English, which says, quote, the weapon of expulsion is the most efficient of those that remain in Israeli hands, end quote. Melman's hand-wringing moral anxiety is that Israel may be pushed towards more ethnic cleansing. Similarly, Segev's chapter on the topic, titled The Blunder, referred to the failure to disappear the refugees and for allowing them to be, quote, photogenic subjects that begin to win the humanitarian world's attention and concern. Quote, mass deportations were more or less impossible because diplomats and the world press were always watching. Segev concludes that the blunder is all the more surprising because Israel managed to rehabilitate over 1 million Jewish immigrants or settlers in the course of less than 2 decades. He says the refugee problem could have been rehabilitated as well. And this, he says, would not have required allowing them to return to their homes in Israel. The blunder then for him was a failure to take advantage of the millionaires who offered to finance the rehabilitation and to give it a humanitarian veneer so that Zionist history would have seemed that much more noble. Segev never writes ethnic cleansing or colonialism, and it is not clear exactly what he means by rehabilitation. But the features of settler colonial memory practice are there, the recognition and the disavowal of Palestinians. Again, Palestinians are largely absent from his version of the story except as objects of Zionist actions. In both Melman and Segev's account, as well as a recent Israeli one who discovered the transfer scheme in the archives, Palestinians are entirely absent. Recently, I discovered that the Italian architect of the scheme, Ada Sereni, has a living grandson in the United States. His name is Elon Confino. He is a historian at University of Massachusetts in Amherst and is a seeming ally. He has written about parallels between the Holocaust and the Nekbah, for whatever that's worth, has argued against the ILH definition that conflates Zionism and anti-Semitism, and so on. So I got in touch in the hopes that he might have more information on his grandmother, Ada Sereni, and perhaps in the naive hope that we might explore together possibilities of justice for Mahmoud's descendants. Mahmoud has passed away and his 4 children are all still stateless and now scattered in different parts of the world seeking stability. Confino evaded my emails and instead wrote a piece soon afterwards in 972 magazine, where he attempts to salvage his grandparents' legacies as one of coexistence rather than an actual past as Zionist members of the Haganah. I will conclude with what I had hoped we could imagine and discuss here, different notions of justice for Palestinians in the absence of political justice, which is of course risky territory, but also seems absurd now that Israel is committing mass atrocities in broad daylight, aka live streaming a genocide. It's risky to go down this course, for most scholars on reparations and other forms of justice are against individuated restitution, and instead argue that political justice is what matters most. And here I'm thinking of the December 12th movement based in Harlem for Black reparations in the United States for the descendants of the enslaved, or Mahmoud Mamdani's argument on the question of political justice in the wake of the Nuremberg trials, and so on. But what are we to do when there is no semblance of political justice on the horizon? When someone like Confino can easily go about his life as if he is an ally to Palestinians, while simultaneously taking part in the obfuscating of his family's ethnic cleansing legacy, while meanwhile Mahmoud's children and grandchildren continue to struggle with the outfalls of dispossession. I'll stop there and hope that we have time for discussion on these questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Hadil, for this baffling, quite amazing story. I just like to mention for the audience that if you'd like to ask a question or offer a comment, you can do that at the Q&A or wait till the end, and there might be chance also for asking in voice. We move to our second speaker, Michael Avanzato, is a PhD candidate at the Department of History and Classical Studies at McGill University in Montreal. He holds a Master of Arts in Public Policy and International Affairs from the American University of Beirut and a Bachelor of Arts in Legal Studies and History from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Michael's research focuses on British imperialism in Palestine, particularly in late Ottoman and early Mandate period. His current project is a critical analysis of the Palestine Exploration Fund and their role in shaping the British occupation of Palestine. Prior to starting his doctoral studies, he was the coordinator of the Palestine Land Studies Center at the American University of Beirut, as well as contributing writer for Beirut Today. The title of his talk is Engineers and Evangelicals, the Imperial Network of the Palestine Exploration Fund. Michael, over to you.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Nadine. I just want to see, is it possible for me to play a slideshow here and share my screen?
Rana? Oh, okay.
Can you see that? Okay, perfect.
Yes, I can see it. I can't see you. I hope the everyone else can. Or now maybe.
Okay, is that
okay? Go
all
on.
set?
Yeah.
All right. So thank you again for the introduction. I will be talking about the Palestine Exploration Fund, which is a British geographic society that many of you may have heard of, founded in 1865 to the end of surveying, charting, and mapping the land of Palestine, or as the PEF, the Palestine Exploration Fund, was fond of referring to it as, the Holy Land. And my title here, Engineers and Evangelicals, the Imperial Network of the Palestine Exploration Fund, is due to the fact that the Palestine Exploration Fund represents a fairly unique merger of Anglican evangelical religious motivations, as well as British imperial interests. The initial founders of the PEF were fittingly, therefore, a combination of clergymen, archaeologists, and British imperial officials, largely from the Corps of Royal Engineers. In 1892, Lieutenant Claude Conder of the British Army's Corps of Royal Engineers delivered a speech to the Palestine Exploration Fund describing the fund's goals. Quote, "The Palestine Exploration Fund began its labors only with the object of casting a newer and truer light on the Bible. Yet it has thereby perhaps become instrumental in aiding those who are to form the future population of the country to obtain true facts about its capabilities, and has thus served to promote by peaceful and conscientious labors the future prosperity and lifting up from its misery of that which we call the Holy Land." Here, it's important to note that the Palestine Exploration Fund has been examined largely due to its cultural output, particularly in the United Kingdom, where it's giving a very Orientalist view of Palestine. But what Conder is describing here is about the real ties between the Palestine Exploration Fund, Zionist colonialism, and its shaping of the imperial situation on the ground in Palestine, which is what my project focuses on. But before I get too in-depth into that, it's briefly necessary to give just a little bit of the context of the foundation of the Palestine Exploration Fund. As I said, it was founded in 1865. In 1869, the Suez Canal opens. And by 1875, the British come to own more than half the shares of the Suez Canal Company. And by 1882, more than half of all the trade passing through the canal is British, representing almost 15% of total global British imperial trade flowing through the Suez Canal. So this is the context in which the Palestine Exploration Fund begins mapping the area. And they are deeply focused on creating a border around the Suez Canal and understanding the territory near it. And also, it's important to note that the Palestine Exploration Fund is operating in Ottoman Palestine for the most part until the foundation of the mandate. And it's doing so with the permission of the Ottoman government there. Here, I just have a painting of the HMS Phoenix during the bombardment of Acre in 1832 during the rebellion of Muhammad Ali, because it's important here to note the relationship is changing between the British and Ottoman empires. At first, throughout the early part of the 19th century, the British are very dedicated to the preservation of the Ottoman Empire in terms of keeping them safe both from internal threats, such as here with the European intervention, working alongside the Ottomans against Muhammad Ali, and also against external threats, such as when the British entered the Crimean War alongside the Ottomans to fight off Russian invasion. But by the end of the 19th century, this is no longer so clearly the case, and the British Empire is beginning to pivot towards what many of us are more familiar with, which is the idea that the Ottoman Empire should be broken down for the British Imperium and divided up amongst the Europeans. And one of the ways in which we see this pursued is the then ongoing so-called Peaceful Crusade. Historian Alexander Scholz describes the Peaceful Crusade as, quote, the gradual reconquest of the Holy Land for Christianity through religious, cultural, and philanthropical penetration. You can see on the right here, Beit Basel in Safed, which is a hospital run by the London Society for Promoting Christianity Amongst the Jews. This is one of many missionary groups that were active in Palestine in the late Ottoman period. But as historian Osama Mektesi points out in his work, Artillery of Heaven, a lot of these conversion efforts don't amount to much. And neither the Zionist immigrants nor the indigenous Palestinian population are at all interested in converting to British-style Anglicanism. And therefore, the Palestine Exploration Fund is part of a shift to what Regina Sharif terms scientific Zionism, which is the application of then modern science to advocate for the settlement of Palestine and to prove the validity of Christian religious theory. So rather than attempting to convert the population of Palestinians, it's this effort to use science to encourage a colonial project in Zionism and to prove this kind of irredentist Christendom view of Palestine that was commonly held in London of the 19th century. This is the Archbishop of York and the first president of the Palestine Exploration Fund, William Thompson, describing the British interest. I'm not going to read the whole quote because we're on a bit of a clock here, but describing the British interest in Palestine, and importantly, merging this religious interest with the more hard-nosed imperial interest of taking real control of the country and sponsoring colonial projects there. And it ends with a very typical kind of Orientalist racist view in describing modern Palestine, or modern to them, as essentially without value, whereas they're trying to uncover this ancient biblical Palestine. As I said at the outset, I'm focusing on the Palestine Exploration Fund as a real shaper of the material imperial situation on the ground in Palestine. And the marquee project of this, and the marquee project of the PEF as a whole, was certainly the Survey of Western Palestine, conducted between 1872 and 1877. This was the largest to-date mapping project of Palestine and was intensely focused on the Suez Canal. So there were many, as I said, religious motivations for this surveying work. And as former President William Thompson expressed, there were many religious motivations for mapping Palestine. But Colonel Robert Home of the British Topographical Department of the War Office wrote in 1877, describing the importance of the fund, that in the event of a Russian invasion, quote, Syria, especially the Valley of the Jordan, will become of great importance as offering the easiest road for an advance on the Suez Canal. Under such circumstances, it is of the utmost importance that we should have good maps of the country. There are perhaps other reasons of a more sentimental character that may perhaps be of some weight in completing the survey, but I propose to base any recommendations on the enormous military value of a good map of the country to us. So here again, he's very much focused on the Suez Canal as the locus of British economic power in the region. And importantly, at this point, this survey, the Survey of Western Palestine, was incredibly expensive and a massive undertaking. It was a 5-year-long survey of the country with many different cartographers involved. And this was funded by the War Office. So the War Office the War Office's interest in this project is this attempt to shore up the Suez Canal. It is also the map that will ultimately be used by General Allenby when planning his invasion of Gaza during the First World War. The Survey of Western Palestine is also the first grid-based mapping project of Palestine and the origin of what is still referred to today as the Palestine Grid. This is very important because this grid-based map of Palestine is still used by occupation forces to this day. The Occupation Department of Housing and Construction, for instance, their maps are all still based off of these Palestine Exploration Fund maps, and they use them even currently in housing demolitions. To continue my point about the Palestine Exploration Fund's impact on British imperialism, they were also critical to the formation of the borders of the Mandate State. On the right here, I'm not sure for the audience, but the vertical map is a map of the Nukba created by Colonel S.F. Newcomb, who was a British officer of the Royal Corps of Engineers, as well as a surveyor for the PEF. He worked both in the south and in the north. And on the left, we have a map showing the boundary between the then French mandate for Syria and Lebanon and Palestine. And in negotiating this border, Colonel Newcomb proved critical. So critical, in fact, that the agreement is the Paulette-Newcomb Agreement, setting out the northern border of the British Mandate for Palestine. And this is because Colonel Newcomb, after having served in the Palestine Exploration Fund, sat on the Anglo-French Border Commission from 1921 until the final agreement in 1923. And this border commission was influenced not only by the interests of the Exploration Fund and the former members of the Exploration Fund, but also by Pinchas Rutenberg, who was the Zionist industrialist who was pursuing the electrical program in Palestine. Now, Newcomb traveled from Ras al-Nakura in the west across the northern border of Palestine to the east as a part of a surveying trip to determine where the boundary would be between the French Mandate and the British Mandate. And after his trip, in his communications with the then High Commissioner of Palestine, Herbert Samuel, he thought it was important to insist that both the French and the British work off of Palestine Exploration Fund maps. And when he was successfully able to get the French representatives to agree to this, Herbert Samuels was absolutely thrilled to hear it. Now, we have a similar story in terms of the southern border of Palestine. Obviously, between Palestine and Egypt, this was an internally decided border amongst British administrations. I won't go too into detail, but it's not finally decided on until the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. But the border was originally placed on a 1906 map, which is a little bit blurry on the right, the black and white map, and it was readjusted on a 1915 Palestine Exploration Fund map as the result of the Wilderness of Zin survey undertaken by T.E. Lawrence, which I'll refer to a bit at the end. And historian Gideon Berger describes the shift of this border as being very much in keeping with British needs, particularly as concerns the port of Aqaba. And again, the map here, which was done by T.E. Lawrence, was also completed with the assistance of Colonel Newcomb, who was his military attaché. So Newcomb and the Palestine Exploration Fund are seen both in the north and the south, aiding in constructing the borders of Palestine. The Palestine Exploration Fund also played a role in various Zionist colonial projects. Although the fund did not themselves sponsor any colonial projects, they did more than map the country in terms of their actual activities on the ground. A lot of what they did was also gathering data on the population of Palestine, on the flora and fauna, and giving descriptions of the land and its productive capacity. C.F. Tyrwhitt Drake, an archaeologist with the Palestine Exploration Fund, wrote an entire special paper on the fellahin of the country, in which he describes them in starkly Orientalist and racist terms as, quote, the worst type of humanity that I had come across in the East. And this is entirely indicative of the Palestine Exploration Fund's attitude towards the peasantry of Palestine. And it plays a key role in their advocacy of Zionist colonialism. Charles Warren, who was one of the four men who ran the Survey of Western Palestine, wrote in his work Underground Jerusalem, which is his kind of final report following the Survey of Western Palestine, quote, "Probably all agree that Palestine was once a most fruitful land. Do all concur in thinking it may become so again? There is not sufficient population for the proper cultivation of the land. The country requires a great influx of people. Many a time have the Arab Muslims said to me, quote, 'When will you take this country and rid us of our oppressors?' Meaning the Ottomans. Anything is better than their rule." So here the Palestine Exploration Fund, in its pseudo-scientific language, is not only expressing this very commonly held belief by imperialists that they will in fact be greeted as liberators, but also that the country is ripe for Zionist colonialism. Charles Warren himself later goes on to suggest that this should be done with the Jewish population of North Africa, but he's not entirely committed on who exactly should colonize Palestine, just that it certainly should be in his view. And this man on the left here is Lawrence Oliphant, who is a Christian Zionist from the late 19th century, a private British citizen. He was not himself associated with the Palestine Exploration Fund. In fact, he pursued his colonization schemes completely independently. He would try to raise private funds and build colonies in northern Palestine, which he ultimately does successfully, despite being officially denied the right to do so by the Ottoman government in 1880. He was, prior to this, Quebec's superintendent of Indian Affairs, where he also was negotiating treaties to open areas to white settlements. So you see him deploying some of the same tactics in Palestine. But importantly, in terms of my project on the Palestine Exploration Fund, he was in close contact with Claude Condor, who I opened the presentation quoting, who was not only in the Corps of Royal Engineers, but was one of the 4 lead surveyors of the Survey of Western Palestine. And Condor once wrote, I combated the popular idea that Palestine was no longer a habitable country. What I then said led to an offer from the editor of the Jewish Chronicle to write for that paper a set of articles on Jewish colonization in Palestine. And it would seem that these attracted some attention. They also attracted the notice of Mr. Lawrence Oliphant. He substituted for my proposed colony in Galilee a proposal of his own for a province in Gilead. Now, ultimately, Oliphant is successful in sponsoring colonies in Palestine, but they do end up in the Galilee. And that's not to say that Claude Condor and the Palestine Exploration Fund pushed him that way successfully, and this was a lobbying effort or anything of the sort. But clearly you have these colonial projects falling outside the scope of the fund, making use of both the quote unquote technical expertise and opinions of the fund's surveyors in pursuing their colonial goals in Palestine. It's also important to note that in 1875, at a general meeting of the Palestine Exploration Fund, you have the 7th Earl of Shaftesbury making the claim that Palestine is, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with this propagandistic slogan, a land without a people for a people without a land. And while the Palestine Exploration Fund is not the origin of this slogan, it seems to be one of the first instances of it being used publicly as a political galvanizing propagandistic slogan. So the work of the Palestine Exploration Fund, despite not being colonial projects themselves, was certainly used in conjunction with many colonial projects. I'll conclude talking a bit about the links between the Palestine Exploration Fund and the British intelligence state. These 4 men here are the 4 former leaders of the Survey of Western Palestine, Charles Wilson on the left and Claude Condor, who is sitting in the chair in this sort of purplish tint, will both go on to join the intelligence department following their time in the Palestine Exploration Fund. And Herbert Kitchener from the photo obviously goes on to be the Secretary of War, famously, and one of the main architects of General Allenby's invasion of Palestine during the First World War. Charles Warren on the far right becomes a general in the Second Boer War, where he is obviously participating in the horrific crimes that occur in that conflict before going on to become Commissioner of the London Police. My point here being that this imperial network extends out past the Palestine Exploration Fund. You have instances of people like Charles Wilson and Charles Warren going on from the Palestine Exploration Fund to work in intelligence and kind of spread this imperial ideology. And you have people like Lawrence Oliphant, who are not themselves members of the fund, but are tapping into these intelligence networks for their own private projects. And I'll just end briefly talking about that T.E. Lawrence expedition, which I mentioned in the Sinai in 1915. This is the Wilderness of Zin survey, the last large mapping project of the Palestine Exploration Fund from 1912 to 1914. As I mentioned at the outset, the PEF is doing all of its activities with the blessings of the Ottoman authorities. But in the lead up to the First World War, obviously tensions are higher than they historically have been. Therefore, what the PEF does is they conduct a Wilderness of Zin survey led by T.E. Lawrence and Charles Woolley, two more biblically minded archaeologists, while secretly attaching Colonel S.F. Newcomb to this expedition, but not under their command, working side by side, doing the actual surveying project of the military. So you have the Palestine Exploration Fund being used as a type of cover for the British military's real interests. And I'm about out of time here, so I'll leave it there for any questions or comments later during the discussion.
Thank you so much, Michael, for an insightful talk. I just received the news that Haneen Shahadi apologizes and won't be able to join us, which means we will have more time for discussion later. So we move on to our third speaker, William Thompson, which is not the Archbishop of York from Michael's talk. Will is a consulting arborist and landscape designer, and holds an MSc in environmental science and ecosystems management from the American University of Beirut. He is also currently an MLA student at the Spitzer College of Architecture at City College of New York, and he's an urban designer Forefront Fellow for 2021. His research interests include the political ecology of trees, the use of architecture and afforestation as tool of settler colonialism, and particularly how this takes a shape in arid environments. Title of his talk is Plow in One Hand and Gun in the Other, a critical history of Israeli architectural development. Please, Will.
Thanks, Nadim. Yeah, and it's the irony is not lost on me that I have the exact same name as that Palestine Exploration Fund president. Definitely come from that same stock of people. But I also have PowerPoint to go along, so I'm going to share that. Can everyone see my screen? Or
not yet.
Oh. How about now?
Yeah, perfect.
So in a radio interview, Israeli journalist Maddie Friedman describes, quote, the language of the Israeli military is oddly floral. Code names for things tend to be more botanical, like pumpkin, red pepper, citrus, and cypress. Flower was the code word for casualties on military frequencies. And while this naming system for the Israeli military outposts and operations may seem like a non sequitur, it's emblematic of the way agriculture has been used in the history of Israeli and Zionist settlement in Palestine. Throughout this history, agricultural settlement has been used strategically to control, hold, and settle the land of Palestine. Alongside forceful military operations, agriculture has served as one of the primary pathways for removing Palestinian inhabitants, settling a new population, and reshaping the landscape of the country. So my main argument in this talk is that from its inception, one of the largest uses and goals behind Zionist and later Israeli state agriculture was gaining, holding, and settling the land of Palestine. And while this role has changed throughout its history, it continues to play a part in settler development and land control, although a more specific and less privileged place. In this talk, I'll examine the period from the beginning of structured Zionist settlement in Palestine in the 1880s to the decline in the role of agricultural settlement in the late 70s. While the volumes on the conflict over Palestine could fill libraries, the work on agricultural settlement in Palestine may struggle to fill a few shelves. And this is striking because early agricultural settlement was explicitly one of the main forms of Israeli agricultural settlement. Israeli settlement. To understand and digest this history and track the distinct changes that occur within Zionist and later Israeli agricultural settlement, I've divided this history into 5 distinctive periods from the which you can see here. I'm only going to talk about the first 3 to try to not cram 150 years of history into 20 minutes. But from this early use of Zionist agriculture to its decline in the 70s. This work builds off other studies that look at the place of non-conventional tools of land control, particularly off work previously analyzing the place of afforestation as part of Israeli settlement, and how these dual prongs of settlement of agriculture and afforestation transformed these imagined aesthetic landscapes into a homeland into a material aesthetic landscape of a nation. This is just a showing of my theoretical framework to more fully understand this process of Israeli agricultural development. In a larger global context, I took insights from a number of theoretical models, including food regime theory, the framework of water paradigms, and comparative historical ideas of settler colonial studies to look at shared settler narratives and strategies. When Zionist settlement began in earnest in Palestine in the 1880s, agricultural settlement as a main method of land expansion was not a foregone conclusion. A number of early Zionist planners argued for urban and industrial settlement, like the director of the colonizing organization, the Anglo-Palestine Company, that argued, quote, urban forms of settlement, that is, industry and trade, were the fastest and economically and socially safest way to settle Palestine, end quote. But there are a number of reasons why agricultural settlement became one of the main and privileged forms of Zionist and later Israeli state settlement. Firstly, as early Zionists sought to control land by legal means, this meant that they had to work within the bounds of the Ottoman system. Therefore, much of the land in Zionist holdings had to be cultivated, or they would risk it reverting back to the Ottoman state. Second, agriculture was a way to create a larger presence on the land, thereby establishing greater claim. In this way, without military conquest, Jewish presence through cultivation was a key to ownership and the foundation for a future sovereignty. Third, modernizing and creating a more productive agricultural landscape was a way to present the Zionist project to colonial benefactors, namely the British. I think it's nice that it's that I came after Mike, because I think this is very much that scientific Zionism that he was talking about. Lastly, in the initial planning and early period of Zionist settlement, there was much study of other settler colonial projects, and these methods were often focused on agricultural colonization. So many of these first relatively successful agricultural settlements were created under the auspices of French Baron de Rothschild, and eventually the organization, the Jewish Colonization Association. There was a focus on making these colonies productive, introducing modern agricultural techniques, and taking cues from other settler models. Rothschild used his personal funds to support these settlements, which became the first grouping of moshava, plural moshavot. These settlements took the model of French agricultural colonies in North Africa, establishing large high-value crop plantations. Agricultural experts who had worked in Algeria and other areas of the Middle East were brought in and introduced crops like wine grapes, almonds, mulberries for silk, and oranges. And these crops were export-oriented, and early settlements sought to produce these to compete on a world market. This wave of immigration and settlement, commonly known as the First Aliyah, established around 30 settlements, mostly in the coastal plains of Jaffa, Haifa, and the Lower Galilee. While having the same eventual goals of establishing Jewish control over land and a Jewish majority, during the Second Aliyah in the early 1900s, other forms of agricultural settlement came about that were distinct in their farming modes and practices. The main settlement organs for these were the Jewish National Fund, JNF, the Jewish Agency, JA, and the Palestine Land Development Company. The JNF was organized with the intention to, quote, purchase or otherwise acquire lands, forests, and rights, possession, and other rights for the purpose of settling Jews on the land, and to, quote, clear, cultivate, irrigate, and otherwise improve the lands of the association. Two of the large differences between these earlier settlement organizations and those of the JNF were, first, settlement lands were not privately held, but were given by an individual lease to settlers for 49 years. And secondly, the lease for agricultural land they could employ Hebrew Jewish labor only, and the land was not to be leased to non-Jews. The JNF gained control of more land, new settlement types were promoted, and many within these organizations saw the privately funded moshava as unsustainable in maintaining a large settler population on the land. These two novel forms that came about were the cooperative moshav and the collective kibbutz. The kibbutz was a collective form of agricultural settlement based on the JNF and World Zionist Organization, WZO, principles of Jewish-only labor. The moshav, or moshavim, plural, were alternately based on individual family groups and cooperative purchasing of agricultural inputs and marketing of produce. These settlement types were also distinct in their agricultural production. While the larger moshava relied on small number of monocrops, particularly citrus, these forms of agricultural settlement emphasized mixed farming. One of the main figures who endorsed and promoted this principle was Itzhak Eliezer Volcani. Volcani served as an agricultural advisor to the WZO and director of the JA's main agricultural research station in Rehovot, and thought by intensifying production for market sale and employing Jewish-only labor, Volcani wrote that mixed agriculture could be a way of providing high enough wages to maintain settlers on the land. He saw that the contemporary forms of settlement were based on two opposite staples, citrus fruit and cereals, and sought to create a more diversified, though still market-oriented settlement agriculture that could eventually become a state agriculture. But again, the main motivation behind this expansion was gaining and holding the land, a process that Volcani described to settling the land as, quote, plowshare being our only weapon, unquote. These settlement models took and borrowed from other experiences in settler states. After the onset of the British Mandate, Louis Brandeis, one of the main figures of American Zionism, urged the WZO to invite American experts to come to Palestine to give their expertise on settling an arid frontier like in the American West. One of these experts was Elwood Mead. Mead was an irrigation and agricultural engineer that would eventually become the head of the Bureau of Reclamation in the U.S. Devoted to the ideas of scientific agricultural development, he was called by JA head Arthur Ruppin the, quote, best living authority on agricultural colonization. After a number of visits, Mead created a report relaying his findings, and the report published some of the findings included that settlers needed more technical agricultural training before placement. There was greater need for development of irrigation, consolidation of land purchases, as well as the adoption of the American model of private family farms in settlement. While not all of Mead's recommendations were taken, they influenced later more strategic buying of land, plans for irrigation, and some opposition to the kibbutz-style settlement. In the early establishments of the WZO and JNF, they preferred the cooperative family-based moshav. Chaim Weitzman, the head of the WZO, displayed this opinion, writing that, quote, if we had the necessary funds and conditions warranted it, we should transform all the kibbutz into moshavim, unquote. In addition to the influence of the JNF-directed settlements, other settler models also had sway with the larger farms and larger moshava farms, particularly citrus growers, continuing to expand, and they also looked towards other settler models, also in the American West, inviting American experts like Knowles A. Ryerson and Robert Hodgson to promote what was called the California model of citrus growing. After uprisings against encroaching Zionist land purchase in 1929 and a large-scale general strike in 1936, the JNF began more strategically purchasing land. While Ruppin had devised an earlier settlement placement based on north-south blocks, it was still based on the principle of, quote, purchase the land from Arabs whenever the right kind of offer is made, unquote. However, a large shift occurred during this period of unrest that would impact many policy and support for the Zionist movement and the policy of Zionist land purchase and the preferred form of agricultural settlement. During this period, we see the slow building up of this apparatus of settlement methods that would dominate in the next few decades, distinct from the earlier forms of colonization and agriculture. Throughout this period, those private moshava were pervasive. At the same time, the JNF, JA, and WZO began to create and promote these other forms of agricultural settlement. However, after 1929, the growth and power of these organizations increased, and they became the major players in settlement. But before this, early Zionist agricultural settlement was dominated by these large private monocrop farms, mostly citrus. However, after like this one Petah Tikva, after 1929, the 1925 uprisings and the general strike, the British Mandatory government created a number of commissions to study the continued unrest. And while reports and suggestions from these commissions were usually only slight in their curtailing of Zionist land purchase, there was a rapid response. One of the main ones being more strategic and rapid purchase, Zionist land purchase. However, these land purchases were distinct from those that came before it. Firstly, JNF land purchases started outweighing those of other private settlement organizations, while private agricultural settlement continued to exist and expand. After 1921, no new moshava were established in the pre-state period. Another significant change was the beginning of the struggle between these agricultural settlement forms of the kibbutz and moshav. Previously, the WZO and JNF had shied away from the kibbutz model, preferring the cooperative moshav. However, after the general strike, shifts in mandate policy, Zionist planners began to think more about settlement placement and defense, as well as border creation and security of settlements. Remarking on this, JNF head Avraham Granot said that land acquisition should be principally those that, quote, bore a military value, either because they overlooked Jewish centers of activity or already operated or were likely to in the future, unquote. And thus the kibbutz would become one of the main forces of these outpost settlements, attempting border establishment and a training ground for many of the pre-state military organizations like the Haganah. An early example of this and the predecessor of this military and agricultural combination is the Hashomer. These were organized conquest groups that became part of the Haganah in 1920 that quickly cultivated JNF purchased land and were expanded with greater use of the kibbutz settlement. Strategic acquisition of land also meant more strategic settlement methods, making a shift to the kibbutz as the preferred mode of settlement. The kibbutz was easier to establish, and new methods were devised for rapid setup. During this time, kibbutz were recognized as well suited to perform these security functions, and their design changed slightly in order to root a population in a hostile countryside and enable pioneers to hold their gains. New kibbutzim were hastily established in a form called stockade and tower, that named for the observation tower and fencing around the small settlements enclosing the agricultural area. Although these also represented this melding of agricultural settler and soldier, with a popularized image of settlers of these sorts holding a plow in one hand and gun in the other. Moshe Sharet, head of the JA at the time, remarked that the kibbutz, quote, from a political point of view, I know more pressing task, no more effective weapon than the founding of these border settlements. In securing a more sustainable settlement, there were a number of plans to increase incomes on agricultural settlements. One of these was the introduction of a more formalized dairy industry. It was presented that this production could be integrated into mixed farming and kibbutz and moshav, and while maintaining that family unit. Advocating for this was Itzhak Eliezer Volcani, who I mentioned earlier, who wrote a work entitled The Dairy Industry as a Basis for Colonization in Palestine, where he presented that exported milk from Palestine, particularly to Britain, could be a viable way to increase the income of settlers. During this time, dairy production expanded on kibbutzim and moshav in the fashion put forward by Volcani, attempting to create high-value, highly market-oriented agricultural production. Before the outbreak of the eventual war in 1948, plans were already underway for greater agricultural settlement. In December of 1947, the Committee on Settlement and Irrigation was created within the Labor Party with the purpose of preparing agricultural settlement for an influx of Jewish immigration. This committee formulated a 3-year plan for rural settlement that proposed settling around 60,000 people in agricultural settlements, which turned out to be a vast underestimate. During the fighting, remote kibbutz settlement members served as auxiliaries to the main Zionist fighting force, and kibbutz were seen as the vanguard in fighting. Levi Eshkol, the head of the settlement department of the JA at the time, suggested that agricultural settlers take emptied Palestinian villages, remarking, quote, "We should storm the villages and prepare them for the coming winter, transfer each a dozen families and start working the fields," unquote. Once the fighting had ceased with more than 750 Palestinians displaced, the newly created state set about an intricate program to establish presence on the land captured during the war, creating a complex web of legal measures and bureaucracies used in agricultural settlement. Illustrating this idea in the establishment of presence after capture, Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion stated, quote, "We won indeed in conquest, but without settlement, these conquests do not have decisive value, neither in the Negev or the Galilee nor Jerusalem. Settlement is the real conquest." Although both Moshav and kibbutzim were created rapidly during this time, the kibbutz continued to be a preferred mode of agricultural settlement. Ben-Gurion also said of the kibbutz, quote, "The role of the kibbutz in the state is not in our past. On the contrary, it has expanded to include settlement security and construction in the desert." Between 1948 and the end of 1949, 57 new kibbutzim were established, the majority of them in strategic areas in the Western Galilee, Naqab, and around Al-Quds. These included establishments of the newly created Nahal brigades. The Nahal program combined military and specialized agricultural training as part of compulsory service in the newly conglomerated IDF. And these forces were sent to secure footholds, mainly in border areas that were contested by any Palestinian refugees attempt to return. After this initial spurt of kibbutz settlement, there was a rapid decline in the movement and kibbutz creation overall. In this period, agricultural settlement played a divisive role not only in holding and maintaining a presence on land, but also an active part in the expansion of Zionist territorial gains during the war. But it's important to note that while there's so much emphasis given to agricultural settlement, a rural Jewish population was never a majority in Palestine, reaching its height in 1941 at around 29% of the Jewish population. From this, a number of studies concluded that agricultural settlement was a failure as far as the Zionist effort was concerned, but this doesn't address all the goals of agricultural settlement. And while Zionist agricultural settlement didn't fulfill the notion of creating a nation of farmers or absorb a majority of Jewish immigrants, it was effective in holding and retaining land as a tool of settlement. As Gershon Shafir writes, quote, "The significance of the kibbutz, and later the moshav, quote, in the formation of the Israeli state and nation was much greater than its share of the population." So within the first decade of independence, the government devised a number of strategic plans for agricultural settlement to fill the now interior frontier. The Joint Planning Center created a 7-year plan and divided up agricultural settlement types into these 6 types shown on the screen. So while previously settlements had been planned and given much support, these new settlements were highly planned and monitored. In order to fill the border of the state, more regional planning was developed. One of these first regional plans was in the Naqab, with planning including creating small groupings of 3 to 5 moshavim that would establish a base for eventual larger expansion. I'm running a little low on time, so I might kind of try to skip ahead a bit.
William, it's okay. Since we miss one speaker, you can take it easy.
Okay.
If you need to, so.
I have maybe about 5 more minutes.
Okay.
So, however, in the 1960s, there began to be significant challenge to this privileged place of agricultural settlement. Agricultural settlement creation slowed, and the moshav continued to receive large government protections such as subsidies, import protections, and debt relief. But other forms of settlement began to challenge this privileged place, including the development town or industrial village, that had industrial professions rather than agriculture as their main driver. Commenting on this phenomenon, Moshe Dayan, the then Minister of Agriculture, said that kibbutz and moshav have begun to lose their place as symbols of essential centers, and that nowadays these are typified by these industrial towns. And although beginning to be diminished in their role, they still played a significant part after the 1967 war. While the settlement department developed these agricultural settlements with more precaution, plans were formulated and created for agricultural settlements, mainly in the Golan Heights, West Bank, and a few in the Gaza Strip. But one of the main plans that guided this settlement was the Alon Plan, created by former Palmach commander and Deputy Prime Minister Yigal Alon, to create a line of agricultural settlements in the Jordan Valley, in the high southern plateau of the Golan, and extending down to the southern tip of the Sinai. But this was really the last test of agricultural settlements in the Golan and West Bank, which witnessed a fall from their place as the preferred settlement mode. In the southern Golan, and in these you also see a change from this mixed farming to more high value greenhouse-based agricultural production that will come to typify Israeli agricultural settlement later on. But one of the largest blows to agricultural settlement and its privileged place was after the war in 1973. Because these agricultural settlements were emphasized for their security value, the war further called into question this privileged place of settlement, as the Nahal agricultural soldiers that were at these outposts were criticized for doing little against the modern warfare at the time. Additionally, farm incomes on agricultural settlements began to decline, and agricultural settlers started leasing land back to Palestinians, a practice that was quickly outlawed. But there also began to be challenges from other settler movements. Seeing the partial failure of agricultural settlements in the 1973 war, a new religious settler movement, Gush Emunim, was established in 1974 that preferred a less structured community settlement type that was more similar to a suburb. And then after the ascension of the Likud Party in 1977, the decline of agricultural settlements was really already underway. And I won't dwell on the other bumps on the way down, but it's really in this decline that we can view the tool of agricultural settlement stripped bare of other rationales. One can see this as the explicit acknowledgement of this with statements from members of the Israeli Land Administration, Minister of Agriculture Abraham Katz-Oz, who said, "For the Jewish people, the homestead has a clearly defined purpose. It was later referred to as agricultural land is secondary. The principle is that the land belongs to the Jewish people. It is in the nation's interest that you settle a certain place and draw your livelihood there. The aim is to give the Jewish people a place to settle without any connection to agriculture. In the beginning, all the homesteads were agricultural because there was nothing else, but over time, other land uses have been introduced in order to earn a living. It is a national imperative." Of course, there are still agricultural settlements, but these are much more particular in their use. I've just given a couple of examples here. More agritourism style wineries and ranches, highly controlled environment agriculture like greenhouses, but then also some hardcore religious ideological agricultural settlements. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, William. And we move to our last speaker, Adrian Zakar. Are you with us, Adrian?
I'm right here. All right, I'm going to share my screen.
So I'll introduce you meanwhile. Adrian Zakar is a historian of the late Ottoman Empire and the modern Middle East with expertise in visual practices, intellectual history, and technology studies. He received a PhD in history from Columbia University and then worked as a Milan postdoctoral scholar at the Stanford Humanities Center. He's now assistant professor at the University of Toronto's Department of Near and Middle East Civilizations and Institute for the History of Philosophy of Science and Technology. The title of, as you can see on the screen, title of his talk is Nakba, Catastrophic Ideation and the Meanings of Disaster from 1895 to 1948. Please, Adrian.
Thank you, Nadim, for this kind introduction. So today I want to share with you the preliminary findings of a project that I've been working on for quite a bit now, since I was a PhD student, on conceptual history or genealogy of the idiom Nakba. So now we all know what Nakba means, right? It's an event and a process, an event in 1948 and an ongoing process that goes along the occupation. It's the assertion in 1948 of a settler colonialist political sovereignty over a predominantly Arab land, the denial of the right of return. But once you look at also the print culture in Arabic throughout the 20th century, including before 1948, you can sort of see Nakba popping up in different contexts. And this is what originally interested me. I kept on, while interested in 1948, I kept on encountering other uses and iterations of Nakba. And I wanted to understand, what was the logic of Nakba before the Nakba? Some of it are very, very old usages, like a very old usage, such as the one you see here at the bottom of the screen, Nakbat al-Baramika. This is a medieval, let's say, tale of dispossession and dispersion of a clan under Harun al-Rashid. And I was kind of wondering, how did these medieval sort of poetry traditions and history traditions made themselves available to Palestinians and Syrian authors in the 1940s, right after the Palestine Nakba. And so today we're going to try and look at those different usage and also how the political idiom. So Nakba in Arabic is a term that could be used sort of in a mundane, context, a personal Nakba, just a disaster, but it also has acquired like a more of a conceptual depth and let's say a political idiom that speaks both to a catastrophe that happened in the past, but also perhaps that discloses, hope for a future horizon. This is how Edward Said would put it, for example. But when I looked at existing works on the Nakba, I kept on, encountering this text, Constantine Zriq, Ma'na al-Nakba from 1948. This is written or published in August 1948 as refugees are flooding into Beirut. And he's a professor at the American University of Beirut. And in fact, every single study of Nakba as a concept take us back to this foundational text. And what I want to do today is look at Zriq's context, what he had when he wrote this text. The sense that I got is that we tend to assume that the event happened and then Zriq wrote. And what I want to try and argue today is that to some extent, the making of the concept of Nakba was part of the event of Nakba. And we'll look at how this works. And so I want to suggest an alternative genealogy. Based on my research, I looked at throughout my grad school years. I didn't write my dissertation on this, but that was kind of a side project that I kept with me. And I first started encountering mentions of Nakba in the Great Arab Revolt, the Great Syrian Revolt, and even before. And so I want to give you a quick tour of what I think the genealogy of the political idiom Nakba is in the modern period. According to my research, one of the beginnings, or one of the origins, let's say, of the concept of Nakba has to do with Ottoman governance and Ottoman reform in the 19th century, including the Hamidian massacres targeting Armenian Christians in the Ottoman Empire, followed by the Armenian genocide. This is another moment when in Arabic, the term Nakba makes it to book publications and articles. And that was followed by the Great Syrian Revolt from 1925 to 1927. This is the context in which Zreq is born, right? He's born in Damascus, I think in the 1920s, actually, right? He's a child during the Great Syrian Revolt. And Nakba Dimashq was something I think that he must have heard when he was a teenager. And of course, then the Great Arab Revolt in Palestine between 36 and 39. And finally, the Palestinian catastrophe of 1948, the Nakba. I want to note here, I'm not going to get into it in this presentation, but although, you know, part of what I want to show is that Nakba has a dynamic genealogy before 1948, and it keeps on evolving after 1948. So there's the Naksa in 1967, that is kind of a play or twist on the term Nakba. There's in the 1980s the politics of commemorating the Nakba in Palestine and the criminalization of those commemorations. With this, let's say, emergence of the settler colonial framework, analytical framework in the 2000s, there's the idea of the ongoing Nakba. And perhaps more recently, we've been hearing more and more about a second Nakba in Gaza, happening until now, actually. And so the term Nakba, the construct Nakba, and what it refers to, how it's used, the political imaginaries and the temporal imaginaries it invokes changes over time. And part of what I want to show you today is that this malleability since 1948 also plunges its depth in that prehistory that I want to show you. And part of what I want to show you is kind of a spatial trajectory that the Nakba, let's say, took as a concept, as a political concept from some fringes of the Arab world. So here we are in the Turkish, Kurdish, Armenian, Syriac Arab world in the north. It's a frontier area where some communities speak Arabic, others speak Syriac, others speak Kurmanji, others speak Turkish. And I believe that the political concept Nakba emerged from this terrain in the late 19th century, to then sort of geographically move into Syria in the interwar period, and then with the Great Arab Revolt and 1948 into Palestine. And so we'll go through this today. So the first thing I want to say is that, let's talk about the Hamidian massacres in 1895. It's going to sound familiar to you. Armenians are, let's begin a little earlier. Like many empires in the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire has declared legal equality between Ottoman subjects. That's true of the Ottomans, whether you're Muslim, Christian, or Jewish, now you have equal rights. It's true in Russia with the abolition of serfdom and the granting of limited rights to Jews. It's true in the United States with the abolition of slavery. Now, we know that these declarations of equality often led to retrofitted forms of marginalization and violence. We know about lynching in the United States. We know about pogroms in Russia. And in fact, it's part now of the history of Palestine itself, let's say, as the offshoot of these Russian pogroms. And it's also part of the Ottoman Empire with violence targeting Armenians. Now, Armenians were accused to have formed Fedai organizations. Let's say today we would call them terrorist organizations, and that was used as an excuse to target entire communities and populations. Again, that should sound familiar. And Arabs are watching this, let's say, or Syrians are watching this from Beirut, from Damascus. And what's interesting is that they start rethinking of their own history based on what's happening in Anatolia. And this is, I think, the first book that has the term Nakba in its title. It's called Hafr al-Litham an Nakabat al-Sham. And so I want you to perhaps pay attention to the fact that here, Hafr al-Litham meaning lifting the veil or unveiling the Nakabat al-Sham. And Nakabat meaning Nakba in the plural. And in fact, this is one of the features of Nakba in its inception. It's that it's mostly invoked in the plural. It's the Nakabat. And this is something that will stick. That's something important. At the same time, it's not just Arabic that experienced some, let's say, semantic shift, or at that time, English too, where as part of this 1895-97 anti-Christian massacres in Anatolia, the front page of the New York Times, for example, would talk about another Armenian Holocaust. So now, before that moment, the term Holocaust usually refers to either a ritual sacrifice of animals by fire, and here it's a reference to that because usually Christians were enclosed in their churches and burned in the churches, or to large-scale forest fires. So here there's something that happens in the Middle East that shifts also the English usage of Holocaust. So although the literature tends to portray the Nakba as emerging, let's say, in the shadow of the Holocaust of the 1940s, of the Jewish Holocaust, in reality, these two terms in English and Arabic emerge in a whole different context: the Armenian question, Ottoman reform, the Eastern question, further north in that sort of northern fringes of the Arab world. And more precisely, this area. Here we are in this border area between Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. And see the Holocaust that the New York Times was mentioning happen here in Urfa. And what I've sort of studied more precisely was rural history in these area, including this place, Kızıltepe, where I think some of the earliest non-intellectual invocations of Nakba appeared. Now, Kızıltepe would at that time look like this, and it would be called Tal Arman. It's interesting because it's the only place in the Ottoman Empire with the name Arman in its name, and yet people there spoke Arabic. They were Armenian Catholics, they were Syriac Catholics, they were Chaldeans, but they spoke Arabic. That was their lingua franca. And in fact, I think that was also for them to sort of build links among those communities. Arabic was really practical. And that explains how during the Hamidian massacres, they were targeted, there were some, let's say, extortion. They were asked to first give a thoroughbred horse and then money and then more money until the village was, let's say, ransacked. And the notables, they write down these stories and say, well, at least we avoided a Nakba. And this is, to me, one of the earliest, let's say, non-elite, I mean, we're still talking about rural notables, but in a very small town, invocations of Nakba. What's interesting with this is that it happens not really in relation to Zionism, nor to, let's say, Palestine, per se. But the context here is very similar in the sense that, like, this was part of that moment of, granting equal rights to subjects in various empires, which led, for example, in Russia it led to the persecution of a lot of course, Jews through pogroms, but also Muslims, right? Like Circassians, Bulgarians, Romanians, Chechens. And in fact, part of the story of Tal Arman is to have been the site of a settlement of Chechen refugees. And so what I want to get to here is that the term Nakba, the concept Nakba, responds to, of course, settler colonialism in Palestine, but in a sense, it's not the first time that Nakba, the form Nakba, Nakaba in Arabic, responds to settler colonialism. In a different form. These are Muslim settlers coming from Chechnya, being dropped in Mesopotamia at the expense of native Christian populations that end up being displaced. And so between the 1890s and the Armenian genocide of 1915, you have several steps. Here, I just want to show you this to show you how the term Holocaust is really strongly associated with that Armenian question, again in 1909. And that's way before the Holocaust is associated with anything Jewish, really. And this is how we get to 1915. So 1915, there's here an episode of genocide in Tal Arman. This is a picture of Tal Arman at that point. This is how Turkish books would portray it. And here it's interesting how denial work with very subtle forms of cropping. Here, by cropping part of the building, you can unsee that it's been burned down. And here the question of genocide expresses itself through killing. These people in Upper Mesopotamia were on the way of deportation convoys, so they were not really deported, they were massacred. It's an estimated 95 to 98% of the population was killed, and the rest was assimilated into Muslim households as children and wives. And so here there is a form of settler colonialism, but also that is more similar to, let's say, what happened in North America with assimilative policies. And out of this event, the people who survived, who were able to leave that place, built what is called a memory book. And that memory book was called Al-Qusara fi Nakabat Nasara. And this is, I think, a very important book in the history of Nakba because it brings together testimonies from men and women having survived genocide. It speaks about assimilation. It speaks to assimilated subjects as well. And so let's say this is the first phase that I want to talk to you about, is that moment of the Hamidian massacres, the Armenian genocide. Now let's move on to the mandates, the interwar mandates. And at the beginning of the interwar mandates, there was a big revolt in Syria. It was a popular revolt, an alliance between different segments of the population against the French occupiers to bring back the Faisal's kingdom of Syria. And notable with it was the use of aerial bombardments. For the first time in world history, a large-scale urban bombardment happened, and that burned down a third of Damascus. And that ignited something across the Arab public. So if before 1925, the term Nakba, as Nakabat, was mostly associated with the fate of Armenians, now it would move on to a colonial story. And so here, for example, I found articles by Saad Zaghloul, the Egyptian revolutionary, on Nakbat Surya. And here, an important book at this point that circulated all over the Arab world is Amin al-Rihani's An-Nakabat. It's a summary of the history of Syria from the flood to the Lebanese Republic. And to him, the declaration of the Lebanese Republic is a Nakba. This book is really interesting. It draws on a social scientific project headed by Muhammad Kardali in Damascus. It responds to it. In fact, it's a really interesting, well-written response to that. And I think this is the book that popularizes Nakba across the Arab world. It's serialized and reprinted in different journals among different Arab publics. And so I think this is an important moment, 1925, the Great Syrian Revolt, because it popularizes it not just in Syria, not just in the Levant, but in the Arab world. You find reprints in Tunis, for example, but also more internationally. So here's an interesting little document. It's an interview of Rihani in a New York journal in 1929. By Elizabeth McCallum. McCallum will be a really important advocate for Palestine later on at the United Nations. And he explains his theory of Nakabat in English as the history of Syria in as a tragedy in 5 acts with an epilogue, which is the mandate. So I want you to pay attention here to the date. This is 1929. This is the beginning of violence in Jerusalem. So in Palestine, in mandatory Palestine, there's the so-called Jerusalem riots at this point. And so what we see here is the question of Palestine being introduced by Amin al-Rihani to the American public, interviewed by someone who will later become really important to the question of Palestine in the UN. In a sense, yes, of course. And so in a sense, and here we can see that it's being introduced in English. The spirit of the Nakabat is introduced in English, as a way to also introduce the question of Palestine and the rising violence in Jerusalem. It's also done in the Survey Graphic, which is a journal that early on introduced the idea of the new Negro. And so what I want to point out too here is that let's say, Black Palestinian or Black Arab or Black Syrian solidarity that we see later on in the 1970s and we usually associate with Malcolm X visits to the region. In fact, there's a little bit of a prehistory to that with the New Negro movement and Rihani speaking the language of the New Negro movement in a venue that the New Negro movement had used to introduce this concept of Nakba. There's many other, in a sense, examples like this that I could bring up. So let me just, a couple of minutes of conclusion and move on to the Great Arab Revolt in Palestine and the Nakba of 1948. And I'd be happy to elaborate on any of this more into the Q&A. With the Great Arab Revolt of 1936 and 39, then Arabs have developed this versatile, let's say, discourse and idiom about Nakba and political catastrophe as a way to both put words on a disaster, on suffering, but also to perhaps pave the way for brighter horizons, holding on to hope. It's something that was deployed also for natural disaster, something that we saw the Mankubin of Syria, of Tripoli in Lebanon, but also of Jericho and Nablus in the 1920s. And what happened throughout the Great Arab Revolt is a closer association of the idea of Nakba with the question of Palestine because of an intensification of the revolt itself, right? 10% of the Palestinian male population is either in prison or killed or wounded. And you can sort of see in the press this discourse on Nakba Palestine emerging as something distinct, as something that Arabs understand is part of their fate or part of their future or part of what they're going to have to deal with in the years to come. And while other, let's say, older usage of Nakba persists, like Nakba al-Baramika or Nakba al-Arab fil Andalus, right? So the last thing that I want to address here is the idea that the Nakba was also part of the making of the Nakba. So the concept of Nakba was part of the making of the Nakba. And here's a document that a colleague sort of shared with me. It's a pamphlet that was, I think, thrown by air to people living in the village of Al-Tira near Haifa in 1948. And it threatens them with doing a Nakba over them. And that's before we are here, I think, in July 1948. If you wanted to avert the Nakba, avoid calamity, and escape from your inevitable doom, then surrender. And so in the midst of the catastrophe of 1948, the Nakba was invoked by the Israeli army or Israeli, let's say, forces as a form of threat to, let's say, to threaten Palestinians to leave, right? And so this, then, if we circle back to Ma'na Nakba by Constantine Ezriq, it's published a month later after those events of Al-Tira. And so what I wanted to show you here is that, to some extent, the concept of Nakba was part of the making of the Nakba. It's also part of the aftermath. So, of course, I'd be happy to address this one more. This is the famous Arif al-Arif al-Nakba, a way of documenting, a tradition of documenting what happened in 1948. And then a fluorescence of cultural production that we now associate with Qadri Touqan, Ghassan Kanafani, and Mahmoud Darwish. That's part of this tradition. And so the last thing I want to say before I close is that, in a sense, in order to understand how Nakba from that moment of 1948 became this malleable and capacious imagination of history, time, and politics, it's helpful to dig into the past of the pre-1948 era because we see we can plumb the depth of the concept of Nakba. And today it's interesting to see, for example, the idea of genocide that was there from the beginning, from the Armenian genocide, right? The concept of genocide was invented in the aftermath of the Armenian genocide. And today, when we talk about Gaza and the Gaza genocide, to some extent, we're juggling with the same terms. And Nakba, what's interesting to me is that Nakba is able to accommodate all this. And so, once again, this is part of like an article, actually a couple of articles in a book project, and I'd be happy to tell you more within the Q&A. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Adrian, for an eye-opening contribution. And I'm very happy that we have some time left for a discussion. So, Rana, I'm not sure how we're going to do this. I suppose people among the audience can write their questions in chat, or they can ask in person. مش هيك رنا?
Either or, Nadine.
So there are also people on Facebook that can join us, or those only are passive audiences?
Yes, they can. Of course, they.
Okay, so encouraging everyone to join the conversation. I suppose meanwhile, all contributions are great, and they take us to different places. They are all historical, so I'm going to drop a slightly perhaps a difficult question, even though you all have thought about it in a way, and it shows in your presentation. So what lessons can we learn from history in relation to what's happening today? So Hadil, about the mention of transfer today in Gaza, as it was in the past, in the case you have brought, as well as in Michael's talk, and certainly relations to empire and the determination of borders, imperial networks, then on to William and the examples you showed us in the very end of your presentation about agricultural settlements in West Bank today, or how they were in Gaza until 2005, and in Adrian's talk about the second Nakba that is being invoked today, or it has been, at least in the Israeli public discourse, and now more in action, actually is being invoked very often, though as well speaking of a genocide in a very clear way, as it never been as clear before in Palestine. So let's make a quick round, please, so that we can leave time for others to join us. تفضلي هديل.
Thank you. I guess one thing that is important, especially in what's been happening now in Gaza, as you know, there was so much talk about wanting to transfer the population to Sinai. This is, of course, nothing new, and any sort of historian of Zionism would know this, that as Israel Shahak wrote many years ago, I think in the 80s, maybe even earlier, that this notion of transfer, which sounds very innocuous, it sounds very non-violent, but it's ethnic cleansing, that it's actually very deeply inherent to the Zionist project. And so I think it's only in this recent moment that we've kind of normalized the use of genocide to talk about this level of ethnic cleansing that we're seeing. But certainly this notion of transfer has always been there with the creation of Israel. And of course, I wrote this talk or the abstract before the current genocide began, because I did really want to think about where can we talk about any notion of justice, of course, in the absence of political justice. And we're seeing even a more stark absence of political justice, even as the push in the ICJ and the ICC are happening. So maybe it's premature, maybe it's wrong to talk about it in the absence of political justice when we do have individual actors. But those are some of the thoughts that I've had, is that now any talk about justice feels almost even more absurd.
Thank you, Adil. Michael?
I would say that there's a couple connections between my project and what's happening in Gaza, particularly on the question of imperial interest and imperial motivations. For instance, you see with the Palestine Exploration Fund that this is a Christian Zionist outfit, right? They're imposing their will and supporting Zionist colonialism because of this Christian ideology at first and in their kind of open statements. But at the end of the day, what ends up pushing their actual surveying projects and what actually ends up pushing their behavior on the ground is the very real political machinations of the British Empire. And you see this really well with someone like Charles Warren, who, like I mentioned, is talking about colonialism, but doesn't actually care who the colonists are. They just need someone. If it ends up being European Zionist immigrants, fantastic, works for the British. If it was someone else, it could have been someone else. So their main imperative is pursuing these imperial goals. And I think you see this in the way the United States pursues imperial goals now in Palestine. It's kind of, I guess, the de facto now sponsor of the Zionist movement. And in particular, the way they talk about anti-Semitism in the United States and with these different kind of House bills to conflate anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. The other interesting connection that I've always seen is this question of investment and of economic benefit, where for the British Empire, not only do we have the Suez Canal, which I obviously spoke about at length a bit, there was also a huge British investment in the citrus industry in Palestine, even in the late Ottoman period. This is where, you know, we get the phrase Jaffa cake for the British sweet, because they're extracting this wealth from Jaffa. And so you see this very clear parallel, because, you know, at McGill, where I'm studying, we have a very large pro-Palestine solidarity encampment for Gaza, demanding divestment from all of the ways that McGill University themselves profit as a third party off of the occupation of Palestine and the dispossession of the Palestinians. So this is kind of another similarity that I see, these questions of economic investment driving imperial violence, if that makes sense. Did you encounter much on?
You know, while we're at it, please, Hadil, go ahead.
Well, I didn't mean to jump into the circle, but
No,
I was
please
just wondering from Michael's research, I mean, you know, much of my research that I didn't talk about today is about imperial interests and geological surveys. And of course, the Royal Geological Survey and the Royal Geographic Survey were actually quite interlinked, but it's a whole different set of characters. So I was just curious if in your work, you encountered any of that.
Well, it's oddly enough, some of the same characters show back up, which is part of the reason why I took this sort of imperial network approach. Because in 1865, you have the Ordnance Survey for Jerusalem, which is more geological in nature, and it's focused around the question of water and trying to find a water supply for the city. And the person running that outfit is Charles Wilson, who is one of the later lead surveyors for the survey of Western Palestine. And the success, quote unquote, we don't find any water, so success is right relative here, but that survey was one of the impetuses for the formation of the Palestine Exploration Fund. That big survey of the geography of Jerusalem and the potential water sources is what made them make this whole outfit in a way where they're like, this should actually be an organization dedicated just to surveying Palestine in a way that we haven't done before. So there is a connection, and you see these people going back and forth between these various organizations. It's almost hard to keep track of between, and also they're all named Charles, between the Palestine Exploration Fund, the Survey of Egypt, the geographic surveys, the geological surveys. They're just being shuffled around, you know, like people that have committed some kind of corporate crime being pushed to different departments almost.
Or William, Charles.
Thank
or
you. William, go ahead, please.
Sure. I mean, one thing that was striking, I mean, you know, I talked a lot about the development and support of Zionist agriculture, but of course, the other side of the coin is the constriction and confiscation of Palestinian agriculture, which has been, especially in Gaza, one of the main forms of Israeli policy and action towards Gaza. But another striking thing was that some of the kibbutz that were attacked on October 7th were created by these Nahal brigades that I mentioned, you know, very much blurring this line between civilian and soldier and farmer and soldier. I don't know much about what those kibbutz do today, but in their historical identity, I don't think, you know, it's a blurred line. And then I guess another one is, you know, kind of the rounding out of my talk is that agricultural settlement isn't used as much today, and when it is, it's pretty specific. And I don't, in these wild, renderings we've seen of some Zionist fantasy of retaking Gaza, most of it is these high modern towers, and I don't think agriculture, especially because of people have talked about the genocide and ecocide happening in Gaza, that I think part of Gaza still having a large agricultural workforce and population. I think part of that is the point, is eliminating that agriculture, but also probably it won't be, if there was an attempt at Israeli settlement again in Gaza, I don't think agricultural settlement would be much of a part of it.
Thank you. Adrian.
Yeah, I'm thinking, I mean, I think I don't know, being conscious of the genealogy of Nakba can be helpful both in the public discourse today. So what I've noticed is that we usually think of Nakba as in the shadow of the Holocaust. And there's to some extent a tendency to level the definitions, the features of Nakba to what the Holocaust was before it. And here I think Palestinians and others should have no shame in a way in asserting that Nakba is as old as Holocaust as a concept, and none of them are related to either the Jewish question nor the question of Palestine. It's part of another story. It's a migration of ideas, and I think that can be helpful in asserting, let's say, a more complex and more generative genealogy today. And also, in what I've noticed is that we're very quick to look at the history of Palestinians in, let's say, in the mirror, in the shadow of Jewish history. But here, what I just told you essentially is a history of Palestinian ideas as part of Syrian history, or Levantine history, or Bilad al-Sham history. Bilad al-Sham extending all the way up to Upper Mesopotamia. And I think that's, as much as people have made that argument that the history of Palestine is rarely told either from a global perspective, thinking of Palestinian linkages with South Asia or East Asia, or from a, let's say, more regional perspective, its relationship to the Armenian question, to the Syrian question, to the Lebanese question in that sense. And so I think that gives us another concept that makes Palestinian history interesting and relevant beyond its resemblance or its shared, actually, idioms with Jewish history, for example. It just becomes completely autonomous from it. Not completely, because there's now history, but at least it opens venues, I think, that we can breathe some air. Another perhaps benefit to this is to understand that, anti-Semitism in the Arab world was not what it was in Europe. It has nothing to do with it. There were problems of marginalization in the Ottoman Empire and the Islamic world in general, for sure. That's not, but the obsession with, terrorists having linkages with an external threat, that was not really, Jews in the Middle East were not targeted in that way, not really. Armenians were, and here there's a hidden Armenian history that's lurking beneath the surface. And one of the lessons to that is that, once a people is genocided, there's nobody to speak for it. And so that story hasn't been told because there was a genocide that was, complete to some extent, especially with these Arabic-speaking Armenian communities. And so perhaps the benefit of this work is to rethink these, let's say, these tropes with which we make both analytical arguments, but also political statements often, right?
Okay, thank you. Even though I was hoping to hear more about how you see the Palestinian genocide also and as a new dimension, new meaning, and that is surfacing now, and before that was not so central, I guess. So
I can say,
yeah,
I'll
please
go back to it. Yeah.
Okay. Let's. I'm sorry to to cut you. Maybe we can get back to that, but I'm very happy to invite the people who are attending the talk here. So I see some familiar names. If you'd like to join us in voice, at least, that would be great. Okay. Maybe members of the panel would like to address each other's talks and engage with other panelists.
I have a question for Adrian about how, I guess from your perspective, considering, well, first of all, are you familiar with the work of Alan Confino, who I referenced? Because he does do this memory work comparing Nekba and Holocaust, and it's not my field. I would just be curious what your thoughts were on that, but also curious what your thoughts are on how genocide has largely been kind of gatekept by many Holocaust scholars. And at least in my experience at Columbia and going to talks and workshops there, that it's seen sort of as the paradigmatic example, whereas what you're saying is quite the opposite in a way.
Yeah, very quickly. I don't know. I'll follow up with you so that you send me the reference because I don't know about it. I know of an edited volume of Bashir and Amos Goldberg that has many interesting contributions. It's very interesting. I think it's generally, I think within the Israeli context, if you are in Israel today, there's perhaps some benefits in doing that. And I understand why there'd be some value within Israeli society in opening up these debates. But to me, the starting point of these discussions are just flawed, because they assume that there was first the worst event in history in 1940 to 45, which is the Jewish Holocaust, that led to the Nakba, and that we can then compare them as sacred, untouchable events. The Nakba is not an untouchable event. It's not even an event, as you know. And so to some extent, we tend to paste our understanding of Nakba because we assume an analytical and a temporal precedence of Holocaust. So what I'm trying to say here is that we should just break that and go back to the Armenian question and realize that Holocaust and Nakba originate in the same milieu. Now, what you're describing here with, let's say, Zionist scholars in American universities gatekeeping the question of genocide, the notion of genocide, but also of Holocaust, as I'm trying to say, is very common. It's interesting that genocide victims, there doesn't seem to be any solidarity between genocide victims. That's something we can think of for the future, because it seems to me that the Zionist scholars in general tended to downplay or think of the Armenian genocide as both something that allowed them to put words on what happened, but then also lobbied against the recognition of the Armenian genocide for years in order to keep some military cooperation going on with Turkey and now Azerbaijan, obviously. Azerbaijan buys, most of its weapons from Israel. And so the genocide continues in Armenia as well, right? It's not just in Palestine. These structures continue, and so I think yeah, there's been some gatekeeping, that's for sure. It's part of creating. I think these two things go together. By creating a sacred, untouchable event and putting it in the 1940s, we allow certain conversation and forbid others. I think maybe I'll go back. Maybe there was a last question. I'm not sure. On the question of genocide. Oh, yes, I do want to say, to me, so we take the Jewish genocide of the 1940s as a paradigmatic one. To me, it seems like what's happening in Gaza is really interesting because it's essentially military units harassing, pursuing people, civilians, and pushing them into starvation. This is what happened in the Armenian genocide. This is also what happened before with the Circassian genocide of 1860. And the Circassian genocide leads us to the Armenian genocide as well. And so I think like there is an alternative history of genocide here that unfortunately, sadly, what's happening in Gaza opens up as a continuity of a certain practice of pushing people into starvation, civilians.
Okay, thank you. You wanted to ask a question as well beforehand.
Yes, I have a question about to Michael about cartography. So I'm a historian of cartography. So like Hadil, I have this, my main field is the history of science and technology. I'm wondering about the German and also the Robinson, there's an earlier moment than the Palestine Exploration Fund. What do you make of it? There's German maps, the Kiepertz maps, there's the Robinson expedition. And all of these are not, so what do you make of the British cartography of the Holy Land before the Palestine Exploration Fund?
Well, for Robinson, Robinson was an American. And in the American tradition of this sort of Holy Land exploration, it's much more about the travel logs, experiencing the culture and people of the land kind of rhetoric. And it is in this earlier vein, as are the Germans, of what I was calling the peaceful crusade, which is this idea that there would be a widespread Christian conversion of the people of Palestine. So that is the distinction between this earlier moment, is that in the mapping, they're envisioning, I mean, not maybe as much the mapping, but certainly the Robinson expeditions and the American efforts, you're seeing this very clear attempt to do a religious conversion kind of system and build these schools and build these institutions. And a lot of the institutions, such as the German colony and other areas, still remain in various shapes and forms. But that project that is so embodied by Robinson falls off as you get towards the end of the 19th century, when it becomes clear that this widespread conversion is just not materializing on the ground at all, and there's not much they can really do about it. As for the two mapping projects, this is actually a gap that I'm looking to try and figure out, is that at the same time as you have these earlier German maps, you have the Palestine Exploration Fund, and then you also have, as part of the sort of Tanzimat era and like Ottoman attempts at modernization, the Ottoman surveying teams and movements. And I haven't found anything about the interactions between these people, other than to say the Ottomans did allow them officially to do this, and there was a recognition that, okay, the Germans are going to function here at this time, and then we'll have the Palestine Exploration Fund, and they all have official approval. But I haven't found, and I'm going to London this summer to do archival research with the Palestine Exploration Fund archives to see if there is any evidence of this interaction. I'd be curious to see it. And then I actually have a question, if that's okay, for Hadil. For Hadil, about this Italian support of Zionist colonialism and of the Zionist movement. Is there any link, either in terms of the actual people or maybe explicit ideological reference, between that and the Italian colonization project of Italians in Libya? Were they looking back to this as a roadmap of any kind, or are these two totally kind of separate groups of people doing it?
I think it was because of Ada Sereni's position and having some connection to the colonization of Libya. I mean, it's very vague. I've had a hard time finding much detail on it, but there was something about her international connections. I think Libya was one of the places she was considering. And then they opened it to Latin America, and I don't know how she got connected with Paraguay, and it's still not clear who in Paraguay enabled it. But I think it was because of her sort of international connections, including her relations with Libya, that she was tapped in order to do the transfer scheme. Because, in pre-48, she was part of using ships to bring Italian and I think other European Jews over to Palestine. And so that underground work of hers gave her the sort of chops or the credentials to be tapped for this work. But I do remember reading at some point that Libya was one of the considered locations and that she had some connection with that as well.
Okay, so last one, Adrian.
Oh, no, I just wanted to say for Paraguay, I think there's an interesting, perhaps, continuity of Paraguay being this space of exception or the space of where people can disappear. We think of, Nazi war criminals, we think of, and it's interesting that they would think of this space in particular to transfer Palestinians, a place where people disappear. So yeah, it's so interesting. Thank you. And also
I can just
underground. Yeah.
Yeah, I can just say something about that. There's definitely, I mean, Paraguay is known as like where Mengele disappeared. It does have this kind of reputation. And I did write a short piece for the London Review of Books on this story. And at the time I took exception to minimizing Paraguay to just a Nazi haven, which is how they were trying to pitch it, because Paraguay is actually a pretty active site of indigenous resistance as well. And one of the official languages is Guarani. I mean, it's also the site of like major indigenous genocide as well. But when I was there doing my research, there was another group called the Ixit or something like that. Sorry, I don't remember exactly. But they had won a case for their land to be returned to them in the court. I don't know if it was actually implemented or not, but they were camped out in front of the governor's house, demanding that the legal ruling be enforced. So Paraguay has both this kind of like sordid history of like places where it disappeared. There's also Mennonite communities that went from Germany and tried to create their own colonies there, but it also has a very rich history of indigenous resistance as well. And I think that's why the Palestinians there received quite a bit. Well, there's two reasons. They received solidarity from the locals, but there was also a big Arab community that was actually rather right-wing, but from the late Ottoman Empire, of course, that had been there, that also came to their rescue at the time.
That was my question, if I can squeeze one last in, was what was the interaction with these folks that were forcibly transferred from the Arab population that was already in South America?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the largest Palestinian community in the area is in Chile, which is where Mahmoud eventually ended up to work. But in Paraguay, there was a famous figure named Humberto Dominguez Dib, who was actually married to the dictator Stroessner's daughter at some point. There was also like a Syrian-Lebanese league that came to their rescue to the men as they were in prison, and their lawyer, Richard Badarlici, I think, also was their lawyer, who was of Syrian descent. So there is a pre-existing Syrian-Lebanese community that had quite a bit of political pull. And actually, Israel wanted those guys extradited, and Stroessner said no, in large part because of this lobbying power of the local community, but also because he said the crime happened here, we're going to try it here. So whatever his reason was, but that's what happened.
Okay, thank you everyone for a wonderful panel. We'll close it up here, and I wish you good luck, everyone, with your endeavors. Rana, over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. And